All right, we're in chapter 13 of the book of Genesis, just rolling right along through the book of Genesis, chapter 13. Now, if you were here last week, you might remember, you might not, so I'll catch you up. If you weren't, I'm going to give you a little catch up, so no problem. Chapter 12 is kind of two scenarios in the life of a guy named Abram, and that is the calling of Abram to leave his land, leave his home country, and go to a country God would show him. And with that calling comes a covenant promise, several covenant promises, really. And then Abraham does it. He leaves his home country and he follows the Lord. His faith moves. I mean, God calls him and he goes. It's great. And then we have the very first narrative of his life after his calling, and it's him going to Egypt because of a famine in the land where God had called him. And so it seems somewhat odd that this man, known for great faith, the very first story we have about him is really not a story of faith, but a story of failure. Because he leaves the land he's supposed to be in because of famine to go to Egypt, and then he concocts on the way to Egypt a devious plan. A plan to deceive the people of Egypt, and including the Pharaoh of Egypt, into believing that his wife Sarai is actually his sister. And so they won't kill him and take her as their own wife. And so he allows his wife, Sarai, to be taken into the harem of the Pharaoh. And then God steps up to the plate, and God acts, and God rescues Sarai from Pharaoh and rescues Abram from Egypt by striking plagues against the palace and the household of Pharaoh. It's Pharaoh even that corrects Abram. He says, "Why did you do this to me by telling me she's your sister? Now take her and get out of here. Go." So it's an unbelieving, wicked man like the Pharaoh of Egypt that actually corrects the father of faith, Abram, who we'll come to know as Abraham later on. It's really quite a scene. Well, that brings us up to chapter 13. It's end of chapter 12. They're leaving. Pharaoh kicks them out. Doesn't even kick them out. He has some men escort them out. I mean, he really runs them out of town. And so in chapter 13, I'm going to read the whole chapter, so stick with me. Sometimes I do that, sometimes I don't, depending on the chapter. And this is one where it does make sense. So it says this in verse 1 of chapter 13. Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, he, his wife, and all he had, and Lot with him. Abram was very rich in livestock, silver and gold. He went by stages from the Negev to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had formerly been, to the site where he had built the altar. And Abram called on the name of the Lord there. Now Lot, who was traveling with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land was unable to support them as long as they stayed together, for they had so many possessions that they could not stay together. And there was quarreling between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were living in the land. So Abram said to Lot, "Please, let's not have quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, since we are relatives. Isn't the whole land before you? Separate from me. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I will go to the left." Lot looked out and saw that the entire plain of the Jordan, as far as Zoar, was well watered everywhere, like the Lord's garden and the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose the entire plain of the Jordan for himself. Then Lot journeyed eastward, and they separated from each other. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, but Lot lived in the cities on the plain and set up his tent near Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were evil, sinning immensely against the Lord. After Lot had separated from him, the Lord said to Abram, "Look, from the place where you are, look north and south, east and west, for I will give you and your offspring forever all the land that you see. I'll make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust of the earth, then your offspring could be counted. Get up and walk around the land through its length and width, for I will give it to you." So Abram moved his tent and went to live near the oaks of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. And so we come off of the heels of this really story of failure in chapter 12 to a little bit different story here in chapter 13. And you might read that and think, well, not a big controversy, but actually a lot of stuff happens here in chapter 13. If you zoom in a little bit, we'll see a few of those things. First of all, it says Abram goes from Egypt to the Negev, which is the Negev desert, which means it's in the southern lands, so Negev means the southern lands. He and his wife, all he had, remember Lot was with him. Lot is his nephew, and so Lot travels with Abram. They go in a convoy out of Egypt back to the land of Canaan, starting in the Negev desert. It says this, Abram was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. Now, why was he so rich? Well, if you remember chapter 12, it's from the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh thought this pretty gal was his sister, and so Pharaoh's giving him lots of money and land and servants and camels and donkeys and all this stuff, kind of buttering up Abram to eventually procure his wife from him, thinking it's his sister. It's a weird story. So really, Abram acquires this wealth, at least partially, by ill-gotten means. It's ill-gotten gain, okay? That's what the book of Proverbs would call it. It's kind of tainted. Now, on the other side, you see this. God has promised Abram blessing. God has promised to bless those who bless him, to curse those who curse him, that he would be abundant and bountiful in the land. Everything would go well. And so part of what you're seeing is God's blessing and God keeping his covenant. We've already seen that in chapter 12. Right after the covenant that God gave to Abram to keep him safe, to make sure his offspring would go, and that there'd be tons and tons of his offspring, more than you could count. He's in a hard situation there in Egypt. God swoops in and rescues him. That's chapter 12, keeping the covenant. Chapter 13, we see how God has already done that by making him rich and prosperous. Now, like I said, we know that money is kind of tainted. There's always kind of a stain on that money because of his actions in Egypt. It's always kind of at least an apostrophe in our mind, and we go, well, he's rich, but it's because he did this, And that's what ill-gotten gain does. You think, well, I'll cut a few corners and I'll get that little extra here or there, but always you got to know in your mind that money, that possession, whatever it is, has always kind of got a little bit of a stain on it, because you'll remember how you acquired it. And that's the case for Abram and these great wealth. But as far as riches go, and by the way, this is the first time that riches are mentioned in the Bible, and it's mentioned in reference to Abram. So it's always interesting when you see something mentioned for the first time. And when you think about riches in the Bible, well, I can ask you, just so you think about it. Is money in general, or wealth or possessions, is it a good thing in the Bible or a bad thing in the Bible? It's a good thing? Okay. Who would say it's a good thing? Okay, who would say it's a bad thing? Trick question. You're both right. It's really a good thing or a bad thing. It depends on the context. Usually there's two factors that determine whether riches are a good thing or a bad thing. One is your attitude towards them, and two, how you use them. How you use them. And some people say, no, Pastor, doesn't it say that money is the root of all evil? No, it's that love of money, right? Your attitude towards the money. And then what do you do with the wealth? I'm trying to say wealth and riches at the same time, and it's coming out Welch's, grape juice. I ate too much of that broccoli salad. I'm just all hyped up, I guess. And so, what do you do with it? Are you generous? Do you hoard it? Proverbs talks a lot about that. People who hoard grain instead of selling it, and they'll be thought as selfish and that kind of thing. And so this is the case here. This is just a bunch of wealth. Doesn't say whether it's good or not. It's kind of your attitude towards it. And you kind of see Abram's attitude towards it, and you kind of see Lot's attitude towards it, and we'll get there in just a second. And so also Bethel is mentioned there in verse 3. Bethel is actually not named Bethel there. It's interesting. Jacob is the one who's going to name Bethel, which means the house of the Lord, house of God, house of the Lord. But the readers of this, when Moses wrote the book of Genesis and compiled these things and wrote them all down under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, his audience would have known what Bethel was. So he uses language that is familiar to his audience, but we know Bethel will get its name later in the book of Genesis from Jacob. Ai, you'll recall, is the second city that they go into in the promised land after Jericho. The next city is Ai, and that's where they go. So just to give you some kind of point of reference in the Bible, he sets his tent there, and Abraham called on the name of the Lord there. Abram called on the name of the Lord. So that's interesting, because that doesn't happen in Egypt. I mean, it might have, but it doesn't tell us that. We have no calling on the name of the Lord in Egypt. We have no altar building. You'll notice everywhere he goes, what does he do? He builds an altar, but it doesn't say that he built one in Egypt. It doesn't say that he worshiped the Lord in Egypt. But he leaves Egypt. He goes back to where he had, here's what it says, where his tents had formerly been, to the site where he had built the altar. So he goes back to an altar he already built, goes to that altar and calls on the name of the Lord. And I think what's happening here is that he's not only returning to an altar that he's built before, but he's returning to worshiping the Lord. And I think that's what you're supposed to understand here, because you see a pretty unflattering picture of Abram in Egypt. The father of faith, his faith is weak when he's in Egypt, but then he goes back into Canaan, and what happens? He goes back to the altar. He returns to the Lord. So I think it's more than just he returns geographically to this place. He goes back to this altar. He worships there just like he worships. No. I think you see repentance. I think you see a contrast in his actions in chapter 12 and chapter 13, and we're given to understand it's because he went back and called on the name of the Lord. Book of Revelation, Jesus writes a letter to the 7 churches. In the letter to Ephesus, he says this in chapter 2, verse 55. Remember, actually I think it's 2, verse 5, or 55, I think it's 5. Remember then how far you have fallen, repent, and do the works you did at first. This is what Abraham does. He returns, he repents, and he goes back to the altar that he used to worship at before he went to Egypt. So he went back to doing what he had done before. I stress that because, if you're here tonight and you would say, none of us would know because you look like you got it all together to us, but if you would say in your heart, you're not where you used to be with the Lord, that you and the Lord had a little bit stronger connection, a stronger relationship at a previous time in your life, and back then, oh man, I'm here back then, I would pray and I would see the Lord work and da-da-da-da-da, but you're just not there anymore. Understand this. If you and the Lord are distant, it's not because He's gone anywhere. He's not the one who's left you. It's you that's left Him. So what should you do? Well, return to the altar like Abram does. Go back to doing what you were doing when you were walking with the Lord, when that relationship was strong. What were you doing? I'm just going to throw some things out there. I'm just going to guess. Maybe you were attending church more frequently. Maybe you were in Sunday school and Bible study. Maybe you were reading your Bible at home. Maybe you would sing those Christian songs as you went down the road on the radio or whatever, and you had that time of worship. Maybe you were thinking about Christian things a little bit more. You were talking to your Christian friends more. You were praying for people more, praying for yourself more. Return to those things, and you'll find there He is. There he is. This is what Abram finds. He goes back to worship and he finds the Lord is right there. And the Lord's going to deal with him here and speak to him here in chapter 13. I think about the story of the prodigal son. Doesn't in your mind, if you think about that story in relation to Abram here, doesn't Abram go to the distant land like the prodigal son did? And aren't things bad there, And isn't just and doesn't that prodigal son, he thinks, man, at my father's house, it's so much better. At my father's house, the servants eat better than this. At my father's house, I'd be way better off on the lowest rung than I am here in this distant land. And so he returns. And Jesus tells that parable, and it's not about leaving a country and going to a different country. It's about leaving a situation, a state. And that is in rebellion and repenting and going back to the Father and being restored. And this is what Abram does here. He returns to the Lord. So, go back. Go back. Do what you used to do. This is how we repent. This is how we restore that relationship. We see it with this man. And I think, and I'll get there in a little bit more in just a minute, but I think you see a totally different Abram here in chapter 13 than you see in chapter 12. Let me point out a few of those things in just a moment, but before I do, let me bring up the situation here. It says that he was traveling with Lot, and they had so many possessions, so many flocks and herds, that the land was unable to support them as long as they stayed there. For they had so many possessions, they could not stay together. That's an interesting situation. What's the problem there? The problem is that not enough land, not enough grass. No. It's really not a problem of not enough, is it? It's really a problem of too much. And what do they have too much of? Stuff, right? Too many possessions, too much wealth, too many animals and herds and livestock and all that. And that's the problem. They're too wealthy to be that close to each other. That's the problem. Isn't that an interesting problem? Man, anybody got that problem? Just too much money? Just too wealthy? I'm going to bring you a tithe envelope if you raise your hand. Where are you at? Okay. Goodness gracious. Isn't that that's an interesting problem to have, right? Man, just too much money. Just got too much. You know, it's interesting because chapter 12, it's a famine. And they had not enough. And that was a problem. And now they got the opposite problem. They got too much. Isn't that interesting? You know, sometimes we trade one problem for another. And what happens is we think, man, we have one problem. We think the opposite of our problem would be great. What if I just had that guy's life? Or what if I just had that amount of money or that stuff? And the truth is, that guy has got other problems that you don't have. Isn't that true? And I've had that happen a few times. I had a good friend of mine that, I won't tell you his name, but he wouldn't mind if I did, back in Texas. But, he had a job making a lot of money, but he was never home. Never home. Terrible hours, would get called out middle of the night, all that kind of stuff. And it created problems at home, between him and his wife. And they worked through them, and everything was fine, but it created problems. And so he took a different job where he could be home every night. And guess what the problem was? They couldn't pay their bills, right? He had a different problem. And so I remember he coming to me, and he goes, man, Mike, I'm about to go take this job because my wife's not happy. At least we'll have money. And I said, brother, listen, you're just trading one problem for another problem. And he thought, well, I guess I hadn't thought about it that way. Well, that's true. Oftentimes, we all have problems in whatever situation. Not enough money or too much. I remember when I was actually working on my doctorate in seminary, and I was part of a pastor cohort. It's part of that degree. And so other pastors from different churches, different size churches, different churches all over the country, about 20, 25 of us, and we would meet for these classes, and we could just bounce things off each other and discuss things. It was great, actually. And I remember this guy, I was at a little church with a little budget, at that time. And then this guy was at a big church with a big budget. And I remember him talking about how much he hated. This is what he hated. Man, I hate deacons meetings. He talked about it all the time. Boy, I just hate them. And he'd go on and on. Finally, I said, what do you not like about, what's the problem? He said, man, all we talk about is money. I said, money problems? He goes, no. We got so much money. How are we going to spend it? What are we going to do? It's all we talk about. I wish we didn't even have that money. And I'm like, you can send it to us? That was my thought at that time, because we had the opposite problems at that church, not enough money. But isn't that funny? So not enough money, that's a problem. Here's a guy. They got too much. That's the problem. The land couldn't support them. Some of y'all might be my age, and you might remember a song when I was growing up. There was a song by this guy, Notorious B.I.G., and he said, "Mo money, mo problems." Some of y'all remember that? Some of y'all? I thought about that when I was studying this, and I thought about whatever happened. I Googled it. He died in a drive-by shooting at the age of 24 after he got wealthy. Didn't he live out the title of that song? With money, with success, brought problems, and his problems ended up killing him. And so this is the issue. Too much. We got too much. We're so blessed that it's causing a problem. The problem is that the herdsmen, the shepherds, are fighting and quarreling. with each other. Also, the Canaanites are there, and the Perizzites are there as well. And so, Abram addresses the problem. He says to Lot, please, let's not have quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, since we are relatives. Is this the same guy? Is this the same guy? He's so selfish in chapter 12. And in chapter 13, he is so selfless. In chapter 13, remember, he sacrifices his wife's dignity to protect his own life. Hey, tell him you're my sister, okay? You don't mind going in the palace, do you? Be part of his harem? You don't mind? Good, good. Just tell him, keep that story straight. And then here we got Lot. He's like, hey, listen, whatever you want. You decide. Whatever, you want to go that way? No problem. I'll go this way. You want to go this way? Oh, no problem. I'll go that way. You pick. You decide. And that's all good. I mean, it's a total change of attitude. What has caused that in his life? I submit to you that we see right here the beginning of the maturing of Abram's faith. His faith is growing. Maybe he has learned from his own mistake. Maybe his faith is just developing a little bit more. You think, well, his faith can't be growing too much because he had zero faith exhibited in chapter 12. But it's true, though, that even when you have a faithless moment, your faith can grow from a faithless moment. Because, as we pointed out last week, even in faithless moments, we still see that God is faithful. And Abram knew what he had done, and he witnessed firsthand that God struck Pharaoh's house with plagues in order to rescue Sarai, in order to rescue him. He saw God's faithfulness to him even when he was faithless, and it seems it has grown his faith. You see, famine and failure in chapter 12, and you see humility and faith in chapter 13. It's crazy. He's totally changed. Totally different guy. And let me point this out. He gives us a really good description or a good example of how to handle conflict. But specifically, conflict among family members. I'm sure y'all have never had that. It's so uncommon these days. But just in case you might have that in the future, let's talk about it. Isn't it true that with family members, that conflict is a little bit different than among friends? You know, family members, we know how to push each other's buttons, don't we? We know those hot button issues. And isn't it true that with family, we're maybe at our most comfortable and we're more likely to say things that are on our mind but shouldn't be on our lips, you know? That's right. So because of that, often conflict arises. And also it's true when it's among family, we're really often slow to apologize. I heard people say this, well, they're family, that means you don't have to apologize. They have to forgive me, that's my brother. They have to forgive me, that's my sibling or whatever. And it's that attitude that can often drive a wedge in families. And I've seen that so many times. And I remember a family a number of years ago that lived in the same town. It was a really small town. And there was a man and his sister and their dad. And at various times, they weren't speaking to each other. The sister wasn't speaking to the dad and hadn't in years. And they lived like literally a stone's throw from each other. And so the son wouldn't talk to the sister because the sister wouldn't talk to the dad. I remember thinking you guys are going to die one day. One of y'all is going to die, and you're going to think, man, that was so dumb. I wish I hadn't wasted that time, that I could have had a good relationship with my dad. And I know that the father in that family has since passed away. And I've thought that. I wonder if that daughter went to his funeral. I wonder if she has some regrets there. I bet she does. It's often those family relationships that if we're not careful, they can really become contentious. Here, Abram has a situation that could have caused a major issue between him and his nephew Lot. But look how great Abram handles it. First of all, with love. You can hear him say that. Listen, let's not have a problem. Please, let's not have quarreling among us. That's what he says. You can hear almost in that sentence the love he has for his nephew Lot. Remember, this is the patriarch of the family. In an ancient Middle Eastern society, who was in charge? This guy. He could have said, listen, Lot, you're going that way. And I'm staying right here. But he doesn't. He doesn't. Even in his words, you can tell the love he has for Lot, and you can tell that he actually wants what's good for Lot. He's thinking of he wants better for Lot than for himself. He's not treating him like a nephew. He's treating him like a son, isn't he? That's the amount of love he's showing for Lot. And he has no obligation to do that. It's just out of his love. He's also generous. He says, you pick. You can have the best. Whatever you want, you take it. And I'll take whatever's left over. He's being sacrificial. He's willing to give up something in order to resolve the conflict. How often do we just stand our ground because we think we're right? Abram's right, and he still gives up. There's a proverb here that talks about generosity, and I read it the other day. Proverbs 11:24, it says, one person gives freely, yet gains more. Another withholds what is right, only to become poor. And that's pretty close to what happens between these two guys. Abram gives up the best, and he's blessed for it. Lot takes the best, and he's not blessed for it. He ends up losing it. And so, Abram is following part of the covenant God has made with him to be a blessing. Remember, he's going to be a blessing. Well, he's going to bless those closest to him first, it seems, and he is doing that. Sacrificially, being generous. He's also humble. If you're going to resolve conflict, especially among family members, you got to be humble. You got to humble yourself. You have to humble yourself to say, listen, I did something wrong, and I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. Shouldn't have done that. I'd like for you to forgive me. You're going to have to humble yourself. And in your mind, you're going to think, well, really, they're wrong, not me. Right? Really, it's them that should apologize to me. But that's not humility. And here's what's true. Somebody told me this one time. I think it's true. In any conflict, nobody's 100% wrong. Isn't that true? You say, well, listen, I'm 1%. They're 99.9%. Well, then you can 1% apologize. You know what I mean? You can still apologize for your 1%. I wouldn't say that. Listen, I'm 1% sorry for this deal. I wouldn't say that. But you still got something that you should apologize for. So he does it. He humbles himself. James says this, chapter 4, what is the source of wars and fights among you? Don't they come from your passions that wage war within you? You desire and do not have. You murder and covenant cannot obtain. You fight and wage war. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and don't receive because you ask with wrong motives that you may spend it on your own pleasures. Galatians chapter 5 talks about the fruit of the Spirit and the fruit of the sinful nature. And one of the things it mentions in the fruit of the flesh or the fruit of the sinful nature is selfish ambition. That's the opposite of humility. So here we have humility. Isn't it also interesting that Abram operates with no expectation of reciprocation? You ever say something to somebody because you expect them to say it back to you? Oh, I don't care. You can have whatever you want. And you expect them to say, oh, I don't care either, brother. You can have whatever you want. And they don't. They say, oh, good, because I want this. And you go, oh, are you kidding me? Well, it's because you didn't mean that, did you? You do care. See, Abram doesn't operate that way. Because he says, listen, you take whatever you want, and I'll go the other way. And he means it. Because Lot doesn't go, oh, listen, you're the patriarch, Uncle Abe. I'll do whatever you want. No, he doesn't, does he? Lot goes, okay, now that good spot over there, I'm going there. That's what I want. The best land, I'll take that. He's thinking about himself. And so, this is often the case in families. We have these kind of conflicts. Unfortunately, it's also the case in churches. As a matter of fact, we are a family too, aren't we? We're a church family, and oftentimes conflict arises in churches, and we got to take the same steps that they use here to resolve their conflict appropriately, to make peace, to love, to be generous, to be humble, to not expect reciprocation, to genuinely love one another better than ourselves, not have selfish ambition. That's how we resolve these conflicts. You know, it says here that, that there wasn't enough room in the land, and also the Canaanites and the Perizzites were there. That's a different kind of Canaanites that are in the land of Canaan. The Israelites are going to rout them out of there eventually. They just hadn't yet. But they were there in the land, and so were these other two people groups. And I don't know why it says that exactly that way, but maybe it's saying, listen, Lot and Abram were having fights, and the Canaanites were watching this. The Perizzites were watching this. Because that's what's true when the church has fights. The world is watching. The unbelievers are paying attention. Every once in a while you see a church, well, not every once in a while. Pretty often, you'll see a church make it on the news for some conflict. I remember seeing a news story where a pastor on the front doors of the church punched the lady choir leader in the face, and they had a news camera there. Oh boy, you know? And what does the world think when they see that? Goodness gracious. Why would you want to have anything to do with that church or any other church if you were a lost person and saw something crazy like that? This is why we need to be careful with conflict, especially in the church. The world is watching. We're supposed to be taking the gospel to the world. And we just saw in chapter 12, the world, i.e. Pharaoh, lost, wicked monarch, correcting the father of faith for his immoral behavior. Shouldn't be that way. Oftentimes, these church conflicts will spill out. I'll give you an example real quick. I got plenty of time, so I'm not going to go real quick. In 2000, I got a wireless mic today. I can walk around. I love it. In 2010 or 11, I can't remember, I went and preached a revival at a church called First Baptist Church, Bluford, Illinois. Bluford, Illinois. It's where I learned to pronounce Illinois correctly. If you've ever been to Illinois, you'll understand that one. And so the seminary would send us out at spring break to these churches that signed up to go preach revivals. So they sent me this little church, this little town, Bluford, Illinois. It did not have it had one gas station that was also the restaurant in town. You know what I mean? One of those. And so I went and preached this revival, and I got there, I learned about this church. And this church was First Baptist Church, and there was two other churches in town, both Baptist churches. And they both had split off from First Baptist and started their own church at different times. One of them, relatively recently, somebody got upset, and I'll tell you that story another time, but I probably already have, and they went down the road and bought a building themselves and hired a pastor themselves and started a church. This is my church. This is where I go now. It's crazy. Well, all this had happened. The local newspaper had the headline, Battling Baptists of Bluford. And so I went to this little town to preach a revival, learned all this history, and I went and during the day and knocked on doors and invited people to come to the revival, and they laughed. And very few of them came. They didn't want to have any part of that church or any other church in town. And last spring, that was like 2010 or 11, I can't exactly remember. Last spring, in one of the Facebook groups that I'm a part of for SBC pastors, a guy was talking about a situation going on in his church. And that is the church had dwindled so much, had so much conflict and drama over the years, they were going to close their doors once and for all. You guessed it. First Baptist Church, Bluford, Illinois. They finally were closing their doors for good. And that's what it does. That's what conflict does. This is why we got to handle it appropriately in churches, to the best of our ability. We've got to be peacemakers, but in our families too, because it causes problems. Now, look at one other thing here. So we talked about Abram and how he handled it. Let's talk about how Lot handles this situation. Abram handled it great. Lot, not so much. So Abram tells him this, listen, you pick. You go, and I'll go wherever you don't want to go. And so Lot looked out, in verse 10, and saw the entire plain of the Jordan River as far as Zoar was well watered, everywhere. It was well watered. That's what it says. So much water is like the Lord's gardens. That's like the Garden of Eden. Like Egypt. That's why they went there in a famine, because it had the Nile River. It was well watered. And it seems that is the reason why he makes the decision he makes to go that way. It's well watered. So my sheep will grow and have more sheep, and I'll make more money, and I'll be more successful. More grass for them to eat. And that's the reason he decided to go where he went. That's how he made this decision in his life, was based on where the grass was. But he learned, like the old saying goes, you know where I'm going, the grass isn't always greener. Because, and we'll get there, it'll take us a little while, we'll get there, Lord willing. Lot, the end of the story for Lot is really bad. It ends really bad, okay? And if you could show Lot at this point where this decision would lead him, he would never have made this decision, ever. Well, how did he make this decision? Well, he based his decision purely off of financial gain, good business practice. He does not even for a second, it seems, take into consideration the implications on his family or his own spiritual well-being by going where he was. Sodom, it says it twice here, was evil and wicked. They're evil, the men were evil there, incredibly wicked before the Lord. He goes on and on to say this, verse 13. It seems that was common knowledge. People knew that. It wasn't like a surprise to Lot. He didn't find that out once he got there. No, it was common knowledge. People knew that. And what you'll see about Lot is he keeps getting closer and closer to Sodom until he lives there. And you see how it affects his family. And so when you're going to make a decision, a big life decision, for this in this situation, he was moving somewhere. Or you could say he was taking a job somewhere. But you could make a million applications based off this passage. Where are you going to go to school if you're looking for college? Where are you going to send your kids to school if you're looking at college for your children or grandchildren? Moving somewhere, a job. Who are you going to marry? Where are you going to live? All these things. How do you make those decisions? I'm talking about big life decisions. Do you take it into consideration that decision you make might have spiritual implications for you and your family? This is what's happened with Lot. He moved essentially into the devil's den, this place called Sodom, and it wreaks havoc on his life. If he just had thought about it, if he prayed about it, he would have been way better off. Abram, on the other hand, he makes a decision based off of what? Love, generosity, trying to do what's right, trying to end conflict, trying to be peace-loving. That's how Abram makes his decision. Lot makes his decision based off grass, finances, money. It's going to be best for me and my bank account to go this direction. But it has a cost. It has a cost. Well, the Lord pops up here and speaks again. And it says, after verse 14, after Lot had separated from him, the Lord said to Abram, look, from the place where you are, look north and south, east and west, and I'll give you and your offspring all the land that you have seen. Now, stop right there for a second. How is Abram in this spot where God speaks to him? Why isn't he in a different spot? Is it just a coincidence? Process of elimination, you know? He said, you go left, I'll go right. You go right, I'll go left. So he went the opposite of the way that Lot went, right? Is that why is that what's got him there? No, I'd say not the process of elimination. I would say the processes of God. The providential work of the Lord. Even though somebody else is making a decision, God is still at work. God is bringing Abram to this spot, to this land, because this is going to be the land that he's going to give his offspring forever. And notice that promise there as well. Not only land, I'll give you your offspring forever, all the land that you see. I'll make your offspring like the dust of the earth. Reminder, Abram's wife is barren. They have 0 children at this point, and they are both at an advanced age. And God says, your offspring, who are these offspring? And this land is going to be yours forever. God makes a promise. God makes a covenant with Abram here at this point. Lot makes his decision, and he goes off in his direction. Abram is faithful, is generous, peace-loving. He does the right thing, and God puts him right where God wants him to be, right where God has him. Not the process of elimination, but the providential work of God in his life. And Abram is blessed. So, I think so much application here in chapter 13. So much here. How we handle conflict. How we make big decisions in our life. How we return when we've been unfaithful. There's so much going on here in chapter 13. It's not about just a geographic thing, how they ended up, where they ended up. It's really a lot more of that. You see God at work in this circumstance, in this situation. What brought him to this situation? Why is Abram different here in chapter 13 than he was in chapter 12? Well, because he went through a famine, right? It was a famine that sent him to Egypt. It was being in Egypt that he learned these lessons which seemed to have changed his character for the good. It was a famine. It was a difficult circumstance. It was what the Bible would call a trial. You might be in one right now. Difficult circumstance. I know many of us are. You might be heading out of one. You might be heading into one and don't even know it. But understand that it's often in those trials where our faith is refined, where our character is developed. This is where God uses those to work on us. And it seems that we see kind of a bad situation in chapter 12, but we see a more mature, more faithful Abram in chapter 13. So if you're coming out of one, or if you're headed into one, or wherever you're at, right in the smack dab middle of one, wherever you might find yourself, understand God can use that in your life to develop you and to make you the person he wants you to be. That's how he usually works. It usually takes those kind of circumstances for God to get us where he wants us to be.